Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with JD Ney. He's the director of the Automotive Practice at JD Power Canada. JD, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We're here today to talk about the JD Power Canada Electric Vehicle Consideration Study. Now, it's the second year the study's been done. It's getting a lot of press, raising a lot of eyebrows. So, JD, tell us first of all about the methodology of this study. What did you measure and when?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, this is our second annual study. So it's given us a really interesting chance to actually do some year over year comparisons and provide the industry with this benchmark. But yeah, to your point, it's essentially the exact same study that we fielded last year. We did it at the same time. So this particular study was in field in April and May of this year, and we just published last week. We ended up with almost 4,400 responses, which is very robust for Canadian market research. And we utilized our own internal panel of Canadian vehicle owners. At JD Power, we keep a group of about 100,000 Canadians who have told us that we can reach out to them for research at any point. And so that's the group of individuals that we survey. And in order to qualify for the survey, you have to be interested in or looking to buy a new vehicle sometime in the next 24 months.
Well, it's great. I always like to establish sort of the foundation of what we're starting with, because this is sort of an attitudinal survey where you want to be able to trend year over year. Where are the values? What are those EV purchase intentions? What's happening in the marketplace? So the fact that, you're in field at the same time, same group of people, we can really sort of, dive in now to some of the findings. So tell us then, second year, what are some of the key findings of this year's study?
I guess the big headline here anyway, it is that interest in purchasing an EV is declining or has declined year over year. In fact, it was down, among the group of people that said that they were either very likely or somewhat likely to consider an EV for their next purchase. That percentage is down about 13 percentage points year over year, which is fairly significant.
And so why do you think this is happening? I mean, what are some of the factors that, maybe in the follow-up questions in the study that consumers offer up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big factor really is that, last year when we were in field for this study, the Bank of Canada rate was about 1%, maybe 1.5%. And this month there are talks about it going to 5%. And so I think just, affordability, it is an enormous concern for most Canadians at the moment. The fact of the matter is, the EVs are, despite what, you might be able to kind of squint at the data and see a gap of, say, $5,000 between an average ICE vehicle and an average EV. But that's really kind of missing the point, I think, and missing the important nuance there. If you, let's say, a small SUV size vehicle, so the most popular vehicle type in Canada at the moment, the gap between a small SUV EV and a small SUV ICE vehicle, now you're looking at $20,000 in many cases. So these are more expensive vehicles, and with interest rates where they are, I think affordability is an enormous concern for a lot of people.
What about some of the other factors the study cited, like range anxiety, charging infrastructure? I know groups like the Canadian Automobile Dealer Association are really pressuring, governments to start addressing the sort of wider, issues regarding EV adoption and usage to tackle some of those, opposed to just, these are too expensive. So.
I would say that if I had to bucket the major concerns or the barriers, if you will, I would bucket in one, affordability, and the other, infrastructure. And and there's a lot of crossover between those two, frankly. So even things like range anxiety, as you mentioned. So to be clear, range anxiety is the number one cited barrier in our study. And interestingly enough, actually, all of I'd say the top 5 to 10 barriers or reasons for non-consideration, it's very similar in Canada and the US, but more Canadians cite these issues than do Americans. So, if affordability or infrastructure are challenges to EV consideration in the US, they definitely are in Canada, but even more so. And so, if you take the one bucket of affordability, which we talked about, the second bucket of infrastructure, you can include things like range anxiety in that infrastructure bucket, in that some of that range anxiety is being caused by a perceived lack of charging availability, and certainly a lack of charging availability at home as well.
The other thing you mentioned, the U.S. Numbers, because you do comparable, JD Power rather, does comparable research in the U.S. And in fact, in the same time period, the the interest in EVs went up in the US and went down sharply in Canada. Do you have any sense of accounting for the differences there?
It's important to note it is the exact same survey on both sides of the border, and we field it at about the same time. We make a couple of small adjustments for the Canadian survey. We change miles to kilometers, and we spell the word color correctly. But other than that, it's the same survey. And so I think what we're seeing, frankly, is that with much more robust incentives in place, depending on where you live in the U.S., combined with a significantly more robust and built out charging infrastructure, there are less reasons to be resistant to an EV if you're an American than if you're a Canadian these days.
The other thing I think the study hit on was that once people are exposed to an EV, have driven one, test driven one, it increases the likelihood of considering an EV. What does that mean really for dealers, for OEMs, and governments to a certain extent? They're really all in pushing, whether it's with mandates. I don't want to get into politics of all that necessarily. Full court press to electrify the fleet, and yet a lot of Canadians have never been in these vehicles, never test driven them, and therefore are less likely to sort of be wowed by them. So, what would you say in terms of what those parties might want to consider, based on the study's results?
Yeah, I'd say that very few of the barriers for EV adoption are kind of the car itself. As people get more experience with an EV, certainly ride in one, drive one, their likeliness to consider one goes up dramatically. The challenge at the moment, and this comes as somewhat of a surprise when I'm talking to primarily automotive audiences, people in the car business. The fact of the matter is 55% of Canadians tell us that they've never even sat in an EV. And so there's a real opportunity there to expose more and more people to these vehicles, which, as you mentioned, is a huge opportunity specifically for manufacturers and dealers. So, anything you can do, whether it's, open house or, ride and drive events to get people in these vehicles, it definitely increases the likeliness that they're going to consider one the next time out by significant margins.
Well, you mentioned dealers are spread out across Canada. There's some regional differences as well. So if I'm a dealer in BC, Atlantic Canada, Quebec, the prairies, what does that look like for me in terms of the numbers and where they trend? Which regions are most likely to be those early adopters and which ones are maybe a bit slower off the mark?
Not surprisingly, where incentive infrastructure is or where incentives are built out the most, that's where EV consideration is at its highest. And so BC leads the way in terms of likeliness to consider an EV, followed by Quebec. And then you've got sort of middling acceptance or consideration in provinces like Ontario. And then frankly, quite low levels of consideration in the prairies and Atlantic Canada.
Awesome. Okay. And with this research, you're doing a lot of media interviews. I've seen a lot of headlines, financial posts, otherwise getting a lot of US on this widening gap. What's next? Do you roll out the studies with some of your OEM partners and dealership groups and help them dive in a little deeper in some of the numbers?
Yeah, exactly. And so clients to the study get full access to the data set. Whether they like it or not, they get me giving them a presentation and then kind of a readout of the results, including kind of our suggestions and recommendations for next steps.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for sharing the findings with us today, and good luck rolling that out. Hopefully, as this knowledge shares about some of the gaps, we can help kind of bring consumers into the conversation, because I feel a lot of the conversation happens in the industry, and consumers are sort of in some cases the forgotten factor, but ultimately they're the ones making the purchase decision. So
yeah, absolutely. I should point out too that even though the headlines today are kind of about the gap to the U.S. and declining levels of consideration, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily like a really bad sign or a bad omen for the future. The fact of the matter is, 34% of Canadians still say that they are likely or very likely or somewhat likely to consider an EV. And so that's certainly enough pipeline to keep growing the percentage of EV sales for the foreseeable future. The bottom line is that manufacturers, government, and frankly, utilities as well are just going to have to work closely together to sustain that roadmap.
Awesome. Well, great findings. Always enjoy chatting with JD. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.